Sitting on my left, as we all know, is the Honourable Lloyd Waddy, a former judge of the Family Court, chairman of the Australian Elizabethan Theatre Trust, Foundation Director of the Australia-Britain Society, and Foundation National Convener of ACM, and leader of the No case at the Constitutional Convention in 1998. Michael Kirby writes in one of his many articles, he talks about how all these different people, extraordinarily different people, including Lord Mayor Sutherland, Barry O'Keefe, Margaret Olley, Senator Neville Bonner, Helen Shamho, all came together. And he says, the orchestrator of our symphony was Lloyd Waddy, QC, a Sydney barrister, now a judge. In due course, Lloyd Waddy engaged a brash young activist, Tony Abbott. When he was elected to Parliament, the group appointed Kerry Jones. The group named itself Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. The defence of the Crown in the Australian Constitution came to be heard throughout the land. So, Lloyd, how did you become National Convener?
I think by default. We got together. It all started off in such a way that no one said anything after this Republic nonsense. The Labor Party decided without discussion, that we would be a republic by the year 2020, by the turn of the century. And the thing was that no one said anything much. And Fred Nile came out, and his idea of what the Republicans should do is they should be put, I think, on pinch gut. Am I right, Fred? You're very strong about it. And then one of the RSL chaps in Melbourne was famous, and he always had a parrot on his shoulder, and he thought that they should all be, I think, executed because they weren't in the RSL, or something quite outrageous.
Bruce Ruxton.
And when we met, we thought, well, is this really something that is going to die a natural death if no one brings it out? Because one of the things about attacking other people is that it gives them publicity. And Bob Askin always said, never mention your opposition's name. And Donald Trump is playing this hard. There's never a day that Donald Trump isn't absolutely hit. And no one in America will ever forget the name Trump. And so we lay low. There was a meeting at the Liberal Party when it was down in, was it Young Street or one of these streets down here where they had the Senate? And we just decided that the whole thing really was a matter for all the Australian people. It wasn't a party political matter, and nothing happened. But as it got more serious, a few of us got together and we looked around to say, well, how are we going to do something? And there was Dame Leonie Crimer. Well, she was Chancellor of the University. She could hardly run it. There was the wonderful High Court Judge, Sir Harry Gibbs. He could hardly run it. There was John Atwell, who was chairman, I think, of the Liberal Party, or had been. Neville Bonham was up in Queensland. Stephen Hall lived up in the Blue Mountains. Angelo Hatzatouris was a flat-out solicitor. Michael Kirby was on the Supreme Court, and it just seemed that as we went round the table, I was in the city and I had a wonderful secretary who's a great supporter, and we thought, well, let's kick off from there. And then we argued about what we should be called. And Australians, we eventually said, well, first of all, we're all Australians. No one will worry about that. The next thing is we're going to be for the Constitution, the way it is. And that's got the monarchy in it. So rather than become a monarchist league, which has a totally different outlook, the monarchist league is for all monarchies everywhere. And the first dinner I went to with them, there was a toast to King Zog. King Zog! And I'm afraid I ended up underneath the table in case someone saw me convulsed with laughter. So that's how it happened.
Good. Just before the referendum, the ARM announced a major demonstration in the geographic heart of Sydney in Parramatta Park at lunchtime on a Friday, when everybody would be available and vast numbers of celebrities and entertainment and free sausages. It was announced in all the media, the Telegraph announced it every day, and apparently what they got was not tens of thousands of people or thousands of people or even hundreds of people. All they got were the Republican celebrities. Nobody turned up. So it wasn't reported in the media as it would have been had it been a great success. But Lloyd, you did what no other organisation did in the campaign. Nobody came even close to it. You brought out over 20,000 people into Macquarie Street over the expropriation of Government House by Bob Carr. And I remember that Paul Keating blamed that expropriation of Government House for his defeat in 1996. But bringing out 20,000 people, the Herald said 10,000, of course. But when you looked at that crowd, it would have had to been well over 20,000 because it stretched from the top of Macquarie Street near Hyde Park down to Government House. It was just a mass crowd. Now, Lloyd, how did you do that?
Well, I was very, very cross. The governor, His Excellency Peter Sinclair, was it, had been talking to Bob Carr about the preservation of the house, and Carr had assured him that there would be no changes and that all his staff were safe. He'd gone back and conveyed that message. Carr was on holiday, and then he flew into Australia and announced that Government House was being abolished. There would not be another full-time governor, that we were going to have an old friend of mine, and he'd do it part-time. He'd keep on being a law reform commissioner and reporting to himself as governor. There was absolutely no need for the governor to cross the Great Dividing Range. People in the rest of Australia weren't interested in governors. And then he flew out again on holiday. But as he went, he said, and that's one for Jack Lang. Now, I'm afraid I'm not a great fan of Jack Lang's. And I thought it was the most arrogant, stupid thing I'd ever heard in my life. And I promised the governor I would do nothing whilst he was still in Government House. The night before he left government, I gave a dinner for him at my club, and I asked Alan Jones to come along. Alan said to me, I wish he'd come on my program. And I said, well, he's so angry at being double-dealed, and particularly with his staff, where he's made to look a liar. I said, I think if you ask him, you might have some success. It was only a guess. Well, the next morning, the governor was interviewed by Alan Jones. Meanwhile, I'd been asked what I was going to do. I said, I'm going to do nothing till the governor drives out of Government House, and then I am going to march from the gates of Government House to Parliament. Who'll be there? How many are coming? I said, this is the absolute truth. I have absolutely no idea. But I and a principal are moving on the Parliament. And I really had no idea. I'd been to see Collins, who was the leader of the opposition here, arch-liberal Republican, and I said, look, I think we've finally got something in common. He said, what's that? And I said, you're going to have a president in New South Wales, aren't you? Oh, yes, yes. And I said, you're going to put him somewhere, I imagine. Oh, yes, yes, yes. And I said, are we going to build a new palace for the president, or do you think he could do with the silly old one down the road? Oh, no, we'd put him in there. Well, I said, don't we have a common interest? Don't we have a common interest to keep it? Oh, yes. Well, I said, well, I'm going to call people together. Would you come? Oh, there'd have to be Republicans there. I said, of course. How many would you like? Oh. And he said, they'd have to have banners. Oh, I said, no trouble at all. How many Republican banners would you like? So anyway, he came on board. The press asked me, as I said, what would happen, and I really had no idea. But Alan Jones had brought the whole of the North Shore in the trains. The trains were so full, they didn't stop at stations. There'd have been many, many more at that rally if the government had provided enough trains, but Labor governments don't do that. So that's how it got. Next day the Herald said, who'd want to go into Macquarie Street to be yelled at by Lloyd Waddy? And I thought, well, I wouldn't. But the ABC was very clever because there was a fight in the middle of it. And that fight happened behind our truck when two people were obviously hard to come along and pretend to fight. And you've no idea, there was an ABC camera right there, and within 2 minutes it was gone. That's not fake news, that's ABC News. The other thing that happened after that, have you got time for this rubbish? Afterwards, one of the ACM people came to me and said, this is an absolute disgrace. This is an absolute disgrace. I said, is it? Yes, he said, there are buckets being passed around for people to put money in, and there's no lid on them and people could take money out. I said, well, I think we're trying to defer what we can do in the ACM, but Kerry Jones has organised that. Well, he said, it's disgusting. I said, look, I think we better get out to headquarters. I never went to headquarters, did I?
No.
Anyway, we got down there.
Good. You invited me to join the ticket to stand for the convention.
Yeah.
And you told me in very strict terms that I had to wear an ACM T-shirt, which I then did.
Yes.
But when I came in, I found that you also were wearing an ACM T-shirt, but you were wearing it over your wing collar and bar jacket.
Well, why wouldn't one?
You led that campaign and you came in second to the ARM. You got 1.2 million votes, they got 1.6. You got over 72% of the monarchist vote. The rest was divided amongst 5 smaller groups. How did you achieve such a result?
Oh, a bit like walking from the gate of Government House. Malcolm Turnbull said he wanted to be elected. I said I wanted to be appointed, because if I were appointed, we could get someone else who was elected and another voice of the people.
Christopher Pearson, the late Christopher Pearson, was then working for the Financial Review. He decided that he would come to the morning meetings you held in Canberra, and he describes that. He says that Lloyd Wadders QC, on whom Brian Dawes' comic character of Sir Murray Rivers was loosely based. My recollection was that you sat on the opposition benches as the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, clearly a very clear successor to Sir Robert Menzies. While Turnbull was opposite, he was anxious, he was obsessed, invariably unsmiling in those days. I thought he was somewhere between Oliver Cromwell and Maximilian de Robespierre.
Or the latter. Or the latter.
Absolutely right.
But one of the key moments in the convention was over the argument that the constitutional monarchists should use their numbers to bring up the least worst model, that is the McGarvey model. But you led the constitutional monarchists, who unanimously decided not to vote in favour of that model. And on this, Archbishop George Pell, as he then was, said that he was asked to move the motion for the approval of what they called the bipartisan model, but it was really the Keating-Turnbull model. Yesterday, the monarchists voted with discipline, integrity and honour. Lloyd Waddy was the very model of a modern Major General. They did not vote tactically. Their virtue brought its own reward. Republican disarray yesterday was our own doing. The Republicans know well that to divide is to rule, even when the division is self-inflicted. Why, Lloyd, did you decide to reject the call to vote tactically and bring up that model?
Well, I don't think I was ever asked to vote tactically, but certainly I didn't understand it if I were. I was asked to see Dick McGarvey, who was Governor of Victoria at the time and a former judge, and he'd worked out a wonderful way of wrecking our constitution, and that was that distinguished people such as former governors and distinguished people such as former High Court judges or Supreme Court judges in every state or some mob of people who thought they were distinguished would select a Governor-General, and then they'd have to remove him so that the Constitution would become absolutely constipated, and if you wanted to control it, you had to control the judiciary. And he came to me and he spent 2 hours trying to persuade me that this absurd model would be a wonderful thing for Australia. And I couldn't stop him. So I gave him full time and went on and on and on and on and on and on. About 7:15, I get a bit hungry. And I said, look, Dick, I appreciate what you're doing, but would you just think of me as Marie Antoinette? I am not interested in buying a trumbull. I don't want to go to the scaffold. And then I was called into John Howard's office, and Kerry Jones came, and there were other people there, I suppose there were 10 or 12. And John Howard said, I suppose you're in favour of the McGarvey model. And I said, absolutely not, Prime Minister. And he said, you're not? I said, absolutely not. We said, what are you in favour of? I said, direct election of the Governor-General by the people. And he flew out of his chair and came round the edge of the desk and he said, but that would absolutely wreck our Constitution. I said, yes, delicious, isn't it?
Lloyd, of the current Republican plans, the dominant one, supported by the Labour Party and the Republican movement, is not to go to another referendum, to go to at least one plebiscite in which the people will be asked, are you in favour of Australia becoming a republic with an Australian head of state, thus suggesting we don't already have one. What do you think of that approach?
Well, I think we already have an Australian head of state. The Queen, look, I've got to confess, my last 2 names are Stacey Waddy. The Waddies got the southeast corner of Ireland and a very nice castle by supporting Cromwell and cutting the head off the king. So you can hardly say that it's hereditary. On the other hand, the Stacey formed a troop for the king to get rid of Cromwell, and he was hung, drawn and quartered for his troubles. And I don't mind what the Australian people want to do. And the Queen has said she doesn't mind, it's a matter for the people. Malcolm and I agreed that about 3% of the Australian population understood we had a federal constitution, and none of them understood it, including the members of Parliament, and I'll leave the High Court out of deference. But, I mean, we were spending all our money trying to educate them, and if you keep on having these sorts of things by asking inane questions like, do you want a republic? What do they think a commonwealth is? It's exactly what Cromwell called what he had, a commonwealth. Cut the head off the king and you have a commonwealth. And it's just nonsense asking these silly questions. And I'll tell you, the states, we're a federation, and Britain would be much better off as a federation, but the states will never agree that the majority of people in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane will be able to dominate the whole place.
Thank you very much, Lloyd.